papers and secret records. I have objected both in the past and recently to a few of its policies, but in general my chief difference is that it wishes to remain unknown. The names of some of these other banking families are familiar to all of us and should be more so. They include Baring, Lazard, Erlanger, Warburg. The Warburg started the Jekyll Island thing. Schroeder, Seligman, Spears, Mirabeau, Mallet, Fold, and above all, Rothschild and Morgan. These are the companies who want total world control of the financial system and control of all governments. Now, it was such a thick tome that it was only read by a few academics, and they thought that's as far as it would go, but somebody got hold of it and decided to synthesize what he had said down and put in a little paperback, which came out about 1970-71, and it was called None Dare Call It Conspiracy. Did you ever hear of that book? None Dare Call It Conspiracy became the biggest paperback ever sold in the world. Sold over 20 million copies. And it never went through a bookshop, but it simply told the story of the movement, which was coming incidentally both from communism and capitalism to try and establish some sort of central globalized control. And we're now right in the final stages of the whole thing. And that means that once you have every nation dependent on foreign capital, trying to export its way into some sort of stability, and you can produce a rule which says no nation shall produce its own money, you've got the thing sewn up. Back in 1996, just after John Howard got in as the Prime Minister of Australia, we had the biggest meeting of international bankers in Australia's history. And their meeting was written up in the Australian Financial Review. They met right through the morning, and then at midday, John Howard was brought in, like a kid, to meet the schoolmasters. And this is how the article, which appeared in the Financial Review, actually read. If I can open my glasses. It said this: as John Howard swept into the chandeliered banquet hall to address top executives of 100 of the world's biggest banks this week, he could hardly have known that a trap had been laid for him. He'd only been in, 6 weeks? The bankers, the most internationally influential audience Mr. Howard has confronted since taking office, had spent half a day discussing the price they would demand from countries around the world for bankrolling them. In an increasingly capital-thirsty world, international financiers, the commissars of capital, have become modern potentates with the power to dictate policy to states which have long considered themselves sovereign. By the time Mr. Howard took the lectern in Sydney, the speakers of the invitation-only International Monetary Conference had already set out a checklist of policies. Most explicit was the chairman of the big U.S. investment bank Goldman Sachs and Company, Mr. John Corzine, a former central banker, who was asked by the group to specify conditions for what he called the inherently blunt process that leaves many worthy initiatives and investments without resources. So John Corzine is picked by the bankers to tell Mr. Howard what their conditions are. 1, tax reform. The GST was and is an international monetary fund tax. You will put it in, even though you said never ever. That's not good enough. You've got to stop running trade deficits. You've got to balance your books. You've got to control your public service. And above all, you are never to run a financial deficit again. Now, when a nation issues its own credit, that is termed running a deficit. It's quite a good thing when things are tight, but John Howard was told, you are not to create any money in Australia. We do that now, and we're the international boys. And John Howard just put his hands up and said, well, if that's what we need for foreign investment, that's the price we're prepared to pay. And that is why we have sold asset after asset. And our treasurer and our prime minister tell us with gravity that our future depends on further foreign capital pouring into Australia. But what's the price we pay? If you think it makes any difference if we throw him out and put Beazley out, you're kidding yourself, because Beazley is committed to the same program. So really what we've got is we've got a globalist program which is not just economic, it is a political thing, which aims at moving through the three trade blocks that Alan was talking about towards some final global administration. We've had many people who warned about this. High Court judges have said this means the end of democracy in Australia. The government takes its orders not from the people but from international agencies. That's the price we pay. We've got that, and all of a sudden we've got an awakening here in Australia that is very dramatic, and that awakening is happening right around the world. That is why we're getting these big protests. I don't know if that's the best way to go. It's got to get more intelligent than that. We've got to learn to apply sanctions, but the question is whether you keep your freedom and whether your kids are going to have a stake in this country or not. And if we can't be bothered to do it, we're going to raise a generation, the next generation, even younger than you are now, who are going to ask us tough questions. Their mums and their dads. Is it true, Dad, that at one stage Australians owned their own businesses and their own farms, and they were allowed to own their own homes on their own private blocks of land, and they could have their own investments? Is that actually going to happen? Was it true that was like that in Australia once? And Dad will say, yeah, it was. I can remember that. When I was a bit younger, it was like that. Hundreds of farmers out there. This country belonged to the Australians. How did we lose it, Dad? Well, our politicians told us that we had to borrow more and more money, and we sold our ports and our harbours and our airports and our shops and our minerals and our industries, and more and more money went overseas. The banks were the only ones who made profits. The banks at the moment are making $27 million a day. You probably know that. We actually send out of Australia $100 million every 24 hours in dividends and profits to foreign owners, which should be staying here in Australia. So that's what happened, son. What did you do about it, Dad? Well, I wasn't too sure, son. I was a bit nervous. If you stuck your neck out, you could have been downsized. You could have lost your job. You were sometimes called an extremist in the papers. They reckoned you were a nut. So I just tried to ignore what was going on. I knew this was happening, but me and my mates, we just kept quiet. And we used to come back at the end of a desperate day's work, thankful we hadn't lost our jobs, and we used to be able to sit down and watch television. Most of the stations were foreign-owned. I'd sit there in the evening with a stubby, made by a Japanese or New Zealand company, of course. And thank God footy was on. I could watch the Reds versus the Blues, or I could watch St. George versus Parramatta. I noticed, and I was nervous about this, that even the footy teams were getting bought up by the multinationals. And then, son, there was this terrible fortnight. I don't know how I got through it when footy ended before cricket began. I don't know how I got through it. I used to go down and whinge in the pub, and then, thank God, Warney came on. Mark Waugh made a century. Everything was beaut again, and I could forget all about it. What the hell are our kids going to think of us? The first generation of Australians that wouldn't fight for this country. And they would go back and they would think of our fathers and our grandfathers. You know that the Turks are astounded by the number of young Australians at that dawn service at Gallipoli, remembering our grandfathers. The generation that gave us our freedom. We think, as I've told before, one of the most precious things I've got is a tape. Goes for 20 minutes, played by 4 people who came back from Changi during the Second World War. They had the hell beaten out of them. They'd been ground down on the Burma Railway. They'd been beaten up. They'd worked for 16 hours a day. Finally, they'd ended up in Changi, a brutal place. And the greatest survival rate was amongst the Australians. They cherished each other. They were fiercely loyal to each other. If one was sick or had been wounded, they'd gladly sacrifice their rice ration, even though it wasn't enough for one, so that they could get him through. 15,000 died. And every Sunday evening, they would get up onto what they called One Tree Hill in the middle of Changi. And the pastor of the camp, who was a pretty tough character, used to run a church service just as the sun went down. He said they'd often crawl up on their hands and knees